Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources.
Our topic today is ethylene oxide. I'm Rebecca Pritchett, your host for this episode. I'm an attorney with the national law firm Maynard Nexsen and represent manufacturers and other clients in ethylene oxide regulatory compliance matters before state and federal environmental agencies. I'm joined today by David Fusco and Heather Lynch. David is a partner with the global law firm K&amp. He is chair of the firm's Mass Tort and Product Liability Practice Group and represents defendants in ethylene oxide litigation, as well as regularly being an invited speaker on the ethylene oxide-related issues. Heather Lynch is a board-certified toxicologist and principal at Integral Consulting with deep expertise in the potential human health risks of ethylene oxide. Ethylene oxide is a colorless, flammable gas with a sweet, ether-like odor at toxic levels. It's primarily used in the production of other chemicals like antifreeze, in textiles, plastics, detergents, and adhesives. It is also widely used to sterilize medical equipment, food, and cosmetics, especially items that can't withstand heat or moisture. Ethylene oxide is also allegedly carcinogenic, although that is currently hotly debated. With that introduction, let's jump right in. It seems that ethylene oxide litigation has really been getting more attention in recent years. Are concerns with ethylene oxide something new?
David Fusco, I'd be happy to answer that. Thank you for having me today. The litigation and regulatory concerns are certainly getting more attention these days, but uses of ethylene oxide and potential hazards related to ethylene oxide are something that have been looked at for quite some time. And for example, companies that have been using ethylene oxide in manufacturing operations have realized that it's a chemical that must be handled carefully. It has the potential to level complete facilities if it's not handled potentially. So it is something that has been looked at closely. As far as related to health-related issues, that really has been evolving. Going back to the 80s and late 1970s, there were questions raised about whether it was mutagenic or genotoxic, but it has never really been determined that it is actually a carcinogen. There have been some federal and international agencies that do categorize ethylene oxide as a carcinogen, but that is something that is still really, really hotly debated, and it's really as a result because there's just limited data. There's not a lot in the cohorts to be able to reach conclusions broadly across the general population.
Okay, thanks, David. What have been the outcomes of the ethylene oxide cases thus far?
Before I guess even diving into litigation, looking back at kind of how we got here to your point about those concerns and whether they're new or evolving, really ethylene oxide, there are occupational exposure limits from OSHA that were set. It was regulated. It was one of the 188, I think, hazardous air pollutants that were added under the Clean Air Act in 1990. And the EPA developed NESHAPs, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, related to industries that were using ethylene oxide. So it's been something that has been on the radar for those purposes for a number of years, but it was really in 2016 when the EPA conducted a new second IRIS risk assessment on the hazards of ethylene oxide and concluded that it was 30 to 60 times more toxic than previously thought, and then it was a carcinogen. They also concluded, those risks were elevated based on their analysis of using kind of unique studies and unique models that hadn't been used before in assessing cancer risk. And as a result, you have the National Air Toxic Assessment, which is another EPA program that kind of incorporated that new data from the IRIS, the Inhalation Unit Risk Factor. And basically that National Air Toxic Assessment assesses cancer risk across census tracts throughout the entire country. And it doesn't actually identify cancer risk. It identifies, basically, it's the first step for further investigation. It's a potential. But once that IRIS assessment finding ethylene oxide was more toxic was then incorporated into the National Air Toxic Assessment, all of a sudden ethylene oxide is being identified as what they call a regional cancer driver. And that in turn has led to litigation and tightened regulations related to ethylene oxide. So coming back to your question of what's been going on in litigation, it really has been, flowing since that time. There was ethylene oxide litigation prior to that. Typically, it was employees and occupational exposures in places where ethylene oxide was used either in a commercial for commercial sterilization or manufacturing. But the real uptick has been since the NADA in 2018, and the litigation is evolving and it's still going strongly in jurisdictions across the country. To date, I think there have been 5 verdicts, 3 resulting in defense verdicts, 2 plaintiffs' verdicts. Plaintiff's verdicts kind of bookending that. The first one being a large $363 million verdict back in 2022, and the latest plaintiff's verdict being a $20 million verdict just this year. But importantly, in between those, there were 3 defense verdicts in Colorado, which was a bellwether trial involving multiple plaintiffs, and then Pennsylvania, and another one right on the heels of the first trial in Illinois. So it just shows that it's not settled. The litigation theories are being tested in court, and there are very strong challenges to the claims that plaintiffs are bringing, which are all largely based on this IRIS risk assessment and the determination that ethylene oxide presents these risks, which frankly just aren't backed by science. The EPA's role in evaluating risk for regulatory purposes is far different, and their evaluation of the studies, whether they may be using it under some precautionary principle type of issue, is not what should establish liability in litigation. And I think that's why you're seeing defendants have real success pushing back on these claims, because they just don't have the scientific merit to be able to establish causation.
All right. Thanks, David. Speaking of the science, what did the regulatory agencies base their determination that ethylene oxide is a carcinogen on? What did they base that cancer potency value for ethylene oxide on?
Yes, it is a great one, I think, for Heather to answer, to talk about those cohorts a bit more detail.
Thanks, David. So the cancer determination itself is kind of based on animal, mechanistic, and human evidence. So that sort of classifying it as a certain carcinogen, unknown human carcinogen, is they look at the weight of the evidence across species. But for the actual derivation of the inhalation unit risk, which is essentially just a measure of potency, they are using 2 epidemiological studies conducted on cohorts of sterilization workers. And so these populations are relatively highly exposed, at least historically, before they started changing some of the processes to reduce exposure. So they were using these 2 studies, and they picked out, or they used the endpoints of cancer that showed some statistical significantly increased risk. And in this case, in these studies, it was breast cancer and lymphohematopoietic cancer, respectively. We'll call the lymphohematopoietic cancer blood cancer from now on. That's a little bit easier to say. So that encompasses a number of different types of cancer that are technically different diseases with different potential causes and risk factors, but share some similar characteristics in some ways, but generally are thought of as different subgroups. In these cohorts, there's some where they're analyzing specific types of cancer, but the easiest way is to group them all together. And so when they grouped them all together, there was an increased risk potentially seen in the highly exposed workers. And that's only in the analysis where they compared them to the workers that had no exposure to ethylene oxide. So the interesting thing here is that the actual analysis of mortality from both of these cancer types, when you compared it to the general population, was not elevated. None of the groups, even the highest exposed groups, had any increased mortality relative to what you'd expect just based on background rates. But the statistically significant increases we saw in these 2 types of cancers, or that they observed in these cancers, were when they analyzed those highly exposed workers at the highest exposure group compared to the workers that had no exposure. And those workers with no exposure actually had a reduced risk of cancer relative to the general population. So for whatever reason that we don't know, they had less cancer than you'd expect. So essentially, when you have a deficit in risk and you compare a group that has the same as the general population, or maybe a little bit more, when you then compare it to a group that has a really, really, really low risk, it kind of artificially enhances their risk. So it makes it look more elevated than it actually is compared to the general population. So really the association might have nothing to do with ethylene oxide, but actually just be an artifact of essentially the comparison population that the authors chose to use for their analysis. So I think that's particularly interesting. And when you put that into the inhalation unit risk methodology, EPA's default is to assume that there's basically a linear association between exposure and cancer risk. In other words, if you draw a line, all the way down to zero, there's some risk all the way down to zero, and it gets higher as you go up higher in exposure. But what we see is that for a lot of substances, even ones we do think are carcinogenic, they actually do likely have a threshold. But in this case, the way the IUR is developed is it assumes there's risk basically down to zero. And I think, as David said, it assumes we have risk at very, very low exposure levels. In fact, at levels associated with background exposure to ethylene oxide, just walking around, regardless of whether you live near a sterilizer or not. So that's kind of the basis, is those human studies, and obviously the way that they were modeled is part of the reason that number is so stringent, essentially.
I would just add, yeah, I mean, from the litigator standpoint of it, such an important aspect of that is you have this limited data, as I've mentioned, and it's limited data that really all of the data points are at these highest exposure levels. And even that data, it's hard to reach any reliable conclusions from that data. But what the EPA did is took this and put into a dual spline model, they called it, or is described, in that it's what they're doing are reaching conclusions at the lowest level of exposures where there's simply no data points. That's an issue because what it has done is effectively said that these levels of exposure down below, we're talking at like 0.01 parts per billion that are increasing risk. I mean, these are levels that are, lower than what the human body produces naturally. By way of comparison, it's, I think the time weighted average limit under OSHA is 1,000 parts per billion. It's just, these are extremely, extremely low levels, and they're not backed by science. And that creates a lot of problems for what you can take away from it. And what can you even do, if anything, to actually achieve lowering levels to that extremely low level that the EPA put forth in IRIS.
Interesting. So, Heather, is there any scientific consensus regarding risk of cancer at low exposure levels of ethylene oxide?
That depends perhaps on who you ask, but I would say no, simply because the literature we have in animals uses very high exposures that, if you tried to compare that to a human dose, are well above what even an occupational population would experience. So even if you see tumors in animals at high doses, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll see any type of cancer at a human relevant exposure concentration. So, and as David said, we produce some in our bodies through normal metabolism. There's background sources, automobile exhaust fires, so forth. And so if we really have, many scientists, I think, wouldn't necessarily think that everybody walking around today has an increased risk just because of those background levels. And, when we're looking at things like regulatory derivations, the IRIS value is a toxicity value that is meant to be particularly conservative, I guess, health protective, right? It's EPA's job to have a lot of safety cushion in there in any type of derivation they have that's supposed to be a health benchmark. But to David's point, in terms of especially individual level causation, those values aren't meant to tell you will have cancer at this dose, or you will have an increased risk of some other health effect at this dose. It's not meant to be a bright line really in either direction. And they're intended really for high level screening, population level risk assessments, not for individuals, right? So I think a lot of people would say that just because that IUR exists doesn't mean there is actually cancer risk as low down as you can get the IUR to go, particularly when you're looking at the data being largely in the high dose region in both animals and these cohort studies. And in fact, which we may get into a little bit more later, but, the studies that have looked at communities around sterilizers, at least the ones that are done, a little bit more rigorously, generally typically don't see an increased risk when we're at lower levels relative to the occupational population. So the other thing I wanted to mention was what's interesting is, ethylene oxide is really good at sterilizing because it can, interact with DNA. So that's kind of the part that I think makes people worry. But what's interesting is the scientific evidence really has shown that even substances that are able to interact with DNA often have practical thresholds where we wouldn't expect an increase in cancer. And that's because of all those repair mechanisms in your body. There's a lot of ways that your body can repair damage to DNA and that happens with all sorts of exposures, not just ethylene oxide. And so I think a lot of the scientific community recognizes that there's going to be some exposure where your body can repair any of that damage.
Okay, you mentioned studies of communities. Are there any published studies of communities exposed to ethylene oxide?
Yeah, so there are a few. There are some publicly available studies that some of the public health departments around sterilizers have put out there, but that's a different type of analysis. It's not necessarily peer reviewed, and they're looking kind of at a high level of the incidents compared to the local incidents. But there are also a couple of studies. There's one that was done by Jones et al. In 2023 that was looking at a US cohort. They were using data from the toxics release inventory. And so they're relying kind of on emissions data. They didn't have actual exposure measurements for individuals. It's really an ecological study looking at a high level, sort of broad brush exposure based on where you live, and then, registry data about cancer risk. So there's obviously limitations in any type of a community-based study, but at least with this one, it was published peer-reviewed and was not done specifically, for one community, but was trying to pool kind of risk across a number of different communities in the United States. And what's interesting with that study, despite its limitations of just kind of having this ecological level exposure, i.e., no individual linked between exposure and disease, they didn't identify any statistically significant increases in either breast cancer or blood cancers. They kind of concluded that they maybe saw an association with breast cancer, but when you look at them, they're not statistically significant. So I think that's fairly telling, because they were looking even at areas where there was a higher relative exposure, perhaps because they had some sort of source of emissions. And if they're not really seeing risk there, I think that's somewhat reassuring to some of these communities that live, that where people who live near sterilizers or other people that are handling ethylene oxide.
Heather, you indicated that there was no specific conclusion regarding cause and effect in these studies. Is that correct?
That's right. Most epidemiology studies are not going to be able to establish cause and effect unless they're, a prospective cohort design. And even that, you really can't establish causation with a single positive result, right? It's always weight of evidence. But the community studies in particular, and some of the other studies that we've seen, when the design is sort of at the population level with exposure and outcome, it's very difficult. You really can't. You can use it as like a hypothesis generation or to understand what's to study further, but you can't definitively establish cause and effect there, and certainly not for an individual.
David, how do you see these studies being used in litigation, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of the available studies do play a prominent role in the litigation, especially because it is not as robust as you might see in other areas. But I think it's, the issue there is what Heather kind of touched on, and you get to the general epidemiological concept of trying to prove general causation, and that's that a cancer is associated with a cancer is associated with a particular toxin or exposure. But in the litigation, plaintiffs have to establish more than that. They've got to actually establish specific causation, which is demonstrating that the individual plaintiff was exposed to a toxin at a level that caused their individual disease. And, as Heather explained, there aren't even conclusions that you can really draw on the general causation issue, with any certainty as it relates to the science and the data that's out there. And that makes it virtually impossible to reach any kind of analysis of specific causation. As I mentioned before, when the IRS is looking at the IUR at these lower levels where there's no data points, I mean, it basically makes it impossible to take an individual who has low-level exposures and be able to compare them to someone in the scientific literature that has been shown to have disease, any different than showing it to an individual in the population that is exposed to ethylene oxide every day, or endogenously produced and otherwise, that doesn't show disease. So, I think that is a fight that is really kind of proliferating in the litigation, as it does in most toxic exposure cases, is that you see on the one side a general approach towards arguing that on the plaintiff side that it is a toxin, it's a carcinogen, there is an exposure, they had a disease, they had the exposure, and to try to pull all that together to meet their burden. And you see the defense, I think, aptly going back and challenging that to say, well, one, there are problems with each of the steps, right? But more importantly is, how can you say there's any evidence that this individual was exposed at a level that caused an injury? And what is the science to back that up? Because that's where things really start to fall apart. I would add on the science too, I think an interesting part of what was left out of IRIS is that there, especially in an area like this where there's limited human data, their EPA relied on the animal data, they relied on the the NIOSH cohort that had about 18,000 workers, but they didn't rely on another cohort that had about 7,000 workers. And, other agencies like the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, when they did their own risk assessment, they did consider that data from the other additional 7,000 workers. So that was much more human data. That really increased the pool a bit, and that's where they concluded there was no association with breast cancer. And even though they found, I think, some association with the blood cancers, they didn't. I think they determined that EPA overestimated that risk by like 2,400 times. So it's really just to highlight that there is so much uncertainty here at the basic scientific level of figuring out how and if ethylene oxide is causing injury and disease, and at what exposure level, that becomes a centerpiece of the debate in litigation. Because if you can't prove that, there's no way you can prove that an individual had an exposure that caused their injury, especially when you're dealing with very common cancers, dealing with like breast cancers, for example, or certain blood cancers that are generally very rare in the general population.
Thanks, David. You talked about the 2016 IRIS assessment. Has the litigation and have the defendants who've been named in that litigation changed since 2016?
Yeah, I would say it has evolved a bit. When the litigation first picked up, the litigation, the focus was on largely on commercial sterilizers of medical equipment. I think that it just creates a unique scenario that some of these locations were in more highly populated areas that were drawing attention to potential exposures in the community. You also have the interesting, unique nature of sterilization of medical devices, creating these environmental exposures. So that's where you saw really all the verdicts to date have been in sterilization related cases. And that's where the focus has been, I think, as you see, more copycat cases coming along. But you're also seeing an increase in cases against industrial manufacturers, class actions, individual personal injury cases in multiple jurisdictions. As I think you mentioned, Rebecca, ethylene oxide is used for so many different purposes in society. It's over 50% of medical devices are sterilized with ethylene oxide. Fumigation of spices that we all consume. Manufacture of ethylene glycol that goes into so many other products, polyurethanes and solvents. You go in your garage, you get in your car. It's impossible to kind of encounter things that are made in society that ethylene oxide wasn't somewhere in the process. So, I think with that, you're seeing an attention of the plaintiffs to find other sources, and where they can identify sources, and, using government regulations, state and federal, to find emission sources. And they're using that to then target others in other industries, industrial manufacturing in particular.
Sounds like what's happening is that the plaintiffs are well ahead of EPA and the regulatory agencies, who still seem to be focusing on the sterilization facilities and the manufacturers of ethylene oxide for their enforcement efforts. But that's interesting.
Certainly being more creative, I guess.
Right. Well, you would expect the plaintiffs to be more creative than the regulatory agencies. Outside of the litigation, did the 2016 IRIS have an impact on the regulatory framework related to ethylene oxide?
Absolutely. I think, as you've seen with various other kind of emerging contaminants that we're all watching very closely, these things have, it's kind of in tandem. It's often the regulations that draw the attention, and then the litigation, the plaintiffs' bar kind of follows. It's been kind of happening in tandem here. You had, there are basically six national emission standards for hazardous air pollutants, NESHAPs, that apply to various uses of ethylene oxide. There's a whole process where they have to do an initial residual risk assessment, and then they have to update it every so many years, revisit to make sure that the best practices, maximum controllable standards are being used. And the EPA started to revisit those after the data came out with the 2016 IRIS. So there was a big fight over what was called the MON rule, was the first one, and that didn't eventually get finalized until 2022. And then it was followed by commercial sterilizer NESHAP, the HON rule NESHAP, and which addressed other synthetic organic chemicals. And then most recently proposed was the polyether polyol production NESHAP, late 2024. But I think most notably on that is that, just as recently as last month, the EPA has said they're going to reconsider the Hahn rule. And, inherent in that was basically the fundamental challenge that many of the challenges that have been presented towards those niche apps in court and otherwise have been litigation related to them. And that litigation actually was put on hold because the EPA is now revisiting it. But one of the major challenges is that the EPA didn't have statutory authority to do a second residual risk assessment on the hazards of ethylene oxide, which was, came out of 2016. So revisiting that and, the outcomes of the Hahn rule and the processes that went into it is really going to call into question, I think, all of the niche apps. And it's hard to tell, I think, with a lot of things right now, it's hard to tell where that's going with the administration and what's going to come out of it. But it is certainly, it is a change in direction, and it's revisiting. For example, that was the challenge to the Hahn rule back in 2022 was to say, reconsider it. They reconsidered it and they said, nope, we're sticking with the 2016 IRIS. We're not going to go with the TCEQ's assessment. Everything basically remained the same. Now you've got the 2025 EPA saying, actually, we're going to reconsider it again. And they were careful to note, I think, that they weren't even doing it pursuant to the typical standards for reconsideration. They were doing it within their discretion. So it could end up being a bit of a reset button on all this. And, the regulations, obviously, and what the government does always plays prominently in litigation. I don't think it'll stop the litigation no matter what they do, because the IRIS is still going to be there and the studies are still going to be relied on as they're being relied on. But I think it makes a big difference into the public perception of what's going on and to getting to an understanding of what does the data really mean. It's not anybody, I don't think, is saying that it shouldn't be studied, it shouldn't be considered, it shouldn't be analyzed and addressed. It's that it should be done the right way. And I think, that the EPA has signaled they're going to go back and look at it again. So it's really hard to tell where it's headed, but I think it's going to be an issue that's kind of front and center with the EPA for the foreseeable future. And I certainly don't think we're going to see any other activity on the remaining niche apps until they figure out this issue of the reconsideration.
I had seen some of that on the enforcement side with EPA under a previous administration, requiring fence line monitoring as part of a settlement, things that they otherwise might not have been able to do. But I haven't seen that under the new administration yet. So
yeah, and that's a good point, because that is a lot of what came out of the niche apps. When you look at it, I mean, they got very detailed, right, on the monitoring that needed to be done, process vents, and how much the reductions needed to be done. I think it's 95%, 99% reductions in certain aspects. So you're talking about not just, this isn't something you just snap your fingers and say, we're going to reduce these levels. You're taking companies that have been using ethylene oxide in their operations, consistent with and complying with federal regulations regarding the use of ethylene oxide in those operations. And now they've got to make these drastic changes to meet these regulatory compliance standards, which creates a number of problems, both with production and output and the facilities and various other aspects of what goes into that. And that raises the question of, is it achieving the purpose that it's intended to? But, fence line monitoring is an important one, because, there have been issues that have come up in some of the studies that have been done where they've done monitoring, that the canisters, you're talking about levels so low that the canisters the metals in them can create contamination issues. So that presents a problem. You're talking about levels so low for something that dissipates in the environment relatively quickly. Where's the source coming from? I know in one of the monitoring assessments that was done around one of the industrial sites, they found higher levels of ethylene oxide at a rural background location in the middle of the woods that were higher than the fence line right outside the facility. And they basically said, well, yeah, we can't explain it. It doesn't mean you shouldn't monitor. It doesn't mean there's no reason to figure it out, but it just shows how hard it is to manage, monitor, and address these low levels of ethylene oxide that are consistent with background levels. And that, of course, is the question of whether that is backed by science. And I think that's what they're revisiting.
Thanks, David. Any last words from Heather or from David?
Thanks. I just would say thank you again for having us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you both for joining us today, and thanks to the section. Stay tuned for more podcasts from the section on topics of interest to you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at americanbar.org/Enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.